This is another message from 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 to 5. I call this message, "We Stand Because He Stood Up." The first message dealt with the content of the gospel. Today we look at our response to the gospel. I'm reading now the verses from 1 Corinthians 15. Now I made known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received, in which also you stand, by which also you are saved, if you hold fast the word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Paul goes on to name a lot of others to whom Jesus appeared, including 500 of the disciples at one time. So Paul is writing to the Corinthians, and he says, I made known to you, brethren, the gospel, which I preached to you. The gospel means good news. The word comes from Isaiah 40 and Isaiah 52. Let me read from Isaiah 52, verses 7 to 8. How lovely on the mountains are the feet of those who bring good news, who announce peace and bring good news of happiness, who announce salvation and say to Zion, your God reigns. Listen, your watchmen lift up their voices. They shout joyfully, for they see with their own eyes when the Lord restores Zion. This is the context. Opposing armies on distant battlefields. People waiting behind walled cities. Watchmen scan the horizon, watching for runners coming in the distance with news, good news or bad news, news of victory or news of defeat. If the news is of defeat, the enemy armies will soon be at the city walls, and they will demand surrender. And eventually what is likely to happen is going to be surrender and slavery or death. But if the runners announce good news, lovely indeed are the feet of those who bring good news. Happy indeed are the watchmen who receive the message and pass it on to a waiting city below. Happy indeed are the people who are saved. Happy indeed because peace is secured. With this language of battles, runners, and watchmen, the Bible tells of good news that is to come in a battle 600 years after Isaiah wrote, a battle outside the walls of Jerusalem. A battlefield the size of a wooden cross, where a bruised, brutalized figure hangs breathing his last, where powerful forces of evil, sin, death, and devil prepare to claim victory. It looks like this man who embodied love and compassion, who healed the sick and raised the dead. It looks like it's all over. It looks like the defeat of the God of the universe, the creator of the heavens and earth, the sustainer of planets, of plants, and people. It looks like the devil blew out the light of the world. But on Sunday morning, How lovely are the feet of the women who first run from the tomb with good news. Happy are those who declare the good news of God's victory over death. The Lord is risen indeed. Jesus is alive. This is the gospel message, the message of salvation, the message of peace and happiness, foretold by Isaiah, proclaimed by Jesus' disciples, the gospel which Paul preached, which people received, and of which he writes. Paul is like a watchman on the city walls. He receives the good news and passes it on from those who ran from the battlefield. Those first disciples who ran from the empty tomb, who saw the risen Lord, who saw the nail prints in his hands, who heard him explain the scriptures. And Paul and others wrote down what they had received. And every generation must pass on this faith. And now it has come down to us. Paul says, I preached the gospel, the good news, you received it, and you stand in it. Are we standing today in the gospel? The Greek mathematician Archimedes invented the lever, and he said, speaking of his invention, give me a place to stand, and I will move the world. With the gospel message, those early disciples, with the gospel as their lever, the cross and empty tomb as their place to stand. They became the people known by the world who turned the world upside down. Today we must stand where those early Christians stood, to stand not in our own strength, but in the greater strength of Jesus. To stand means to maintain our position in spite of opposition. God has already won the greatest victory, but life is still a battle to apply our faith in daily living. The life of faith is much like walking across a frozen pond. If the ice is thick, we make it across to the other side, okay. But if the ice is thin, we fall in. The Bible warns of believing in vain. It's like walking on thin ice. We must not just talk the talk. We must walk the walk. We must walk daily the walk of faith, of truth, and integrity. The Bible makes the point that believing in vain is the result of not holding fast to the word which is preached. The word is the good news of Christ's resurrection, the good news that God won the battle. When Jesus hung on the cross and died, that was not the end, because the tomb was empty and Jesus lives. Resurrection doesn't mean that when spring comes, with all the fields green and all the leaves green, it means that God broke death's shackles and Jesus stood up, and we're called to stand with him. The Bible says in Romans 10:9, if you confess with your mouth Jesus as Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Hold fast the word of resurrection. Confess and believe. And live the good news and share it. Jesus is alive.